What happened between the months of October and December 1972 high up in the Andes Mountains of South America is a story told throughout the decades. A tale of unbelievable survival immortalized in writings, film, and memories. You may very well be familiar with this story. You may even know it as the Miracle of the Andes or some variation of that name. Survivors wrote books, movie producers made films, documentaries, and there have been countless other pieces of media produced to tell this very story. Much of what is told about this episode of history revolves around what happened during those 2 months. The desperation, what they had to do to survive. This video is not about that. For you see, the events of the Andes disaster hinged on what happened in the moments leading up to the plane crash itself. Whilst the story of survival is central for good reason, what is seldom discussed is a detailed breakdown of the plane crash itself. This becomes our mission today. This was an extraordinary case, and we have to recognize that there is some difficulty here. The thing is, there really isn't a whole lot that we know of the actual plane crash, and official sources are scarce. Though we do have detailed recollection from those who did survive, they weren't in the cockpit. The pilots did not survive. There is no recorded flight data from the plane, there was no radar coverage of that area in 1972, and the wreckage itself was disposed of, with the site becoming a common grave for the loss of life here. In the interest of not making stuff up, let's handle this case with the level of respect it deserves. Though some finer details are forever condemned to the realm of mystery, we still have more than enough information here to map out the events of the flight and formulate a narrative, putting trust in what we do know. So what happened up there? It's Thursday, October 12th, 1972, Montevideo, Uruguay. In the southern hemisphere, October is springtime with warming temperatures and pleasant skies. Uruguay as a country is only small, and with a population in the 1970s of less than 3 million, the small country only has one main international airport in the capital, Montevideo. At the time, the Uruguayan national and state-owned airline Pluna operated international services across South America with a somewhat mixed fleet. At the same time, the Uruguayan government had been operating domestic services within the country using a fleet of planes that were drafted from the Uruguayan Air Force since the 1950s. As it turned out, the Air Force had a number of very handy small passenger transport aircraft that could easily fulfill this duty. A number of these planes were delivered from the United States company Fairchild Aircraft, or at the time known as Fairchild Hiller. Introducing the Fairchild FH-227, a subvariant of the Fairchild F-27. Though US-American manufactured, the American plane maker only licensed the right to manufacture the plane. They didn't design it. The origin of the plane goes back to the Netherlands and our old friends at Fokker who produced the Fokker F-27 Friendship, a plane which first launched in the 1950s. The FH-227 is, at its rawest, an American-built, stretched version of the Fokker 27, Dutch-designed, American-built, and powered by British Rolls-Royce Dart turboprops. As a passenger and transport aircraft, the Fairchild found some success as a regional airliner across the Americas. Although you won't find any Fairchild 27s flying today, and though many pilots of the aircraft have fond memories of the plane, for some applications it was seen as a dated, underpowered aircraft, and in some circles it even earned the nickname the Lead Sled. Putting that aside, it was a useful aircraft for passenger services. I mean, spiritually, it is a Fokker, and it was a plane the Uruguayan government saw as a necessary backbone of regional operations. So, in the early 1970s, these planes were slowly in the process of being transferred over to Pluna, beginning with the Air Force operating on behalf of the airline in 1970. Then one day, 2 years later, we can only imagine that someone had contacted the Pluna Operations Office with a request to charter one of these planes on behalf of a local rugby team who need a plane to get them to the other side of the American continent to Santiago de Chile, ultimately booking the departure date of October 12, 1972. As the story goes, the Uruguayan Old Christians Rugby Club was scheduled to play against a Chilean team in Santiago in a few days. For what was at the time a young fledgling team, not only was the trip a chance to play on an international level, but it was also seen as a bit of a holiday. The Fairchild could easily accommodate and even had some extra seats left over, so some of those travelling invited loved ones along for the journey as well. An additional passenger unrelated to the group even purchased a ticket at the last minute, for a total of 45 passengers and crew. So, on October 12, 1972, at Montevideo's Carrasco Airport, the passengers arrived at the gate awaiting to board one of these Fairchild planes, which was operated by the Uruguayan Air Force. The plane itself flew with a call sign of 571, reflecting the aircraft's registration. With a maximum operating range of around 2,500 kilometers, the Fairchild could easily cover the 1,300-kilometer journey between Montevideo and Santiago. But the Fairchild is a small plane. It has certain limitations that will soon make themselves abundantly clear. Departing Montevideo on October 12, 571 leaves Uruguay heading west across neighboring Argentina. The pilot in command today is 39-year-old Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas. A pilot of over 5,000 flight hours, he has an extensive career in the Air Force, having previously flown bombers and other transport aircraft such as the DC-3 in addition to the Fairchild. For this journey, he is sitting in the right seat, supervising 41-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Laguarra, serving as co-pilot. Though older than his commander, he was a less experienced pilot with around 1,000 total flight hours. It appears he has an interesting history in the Air Force, as in 1963, he apparently was involved in and survived a mid-air collision event via ejection. He is the one piloting the Fairchild under the watchful eye of the pilot in command. As the flight continued westbound, they encountered a rather inconvenient interruption. You see, in order to reach Santiago, the plane must cross the Andes Mountains. Unfortunately, on October 12, 1972, weather over the Andes was unfavorable. A storm preventing the crossing for the small plane, making passage over the mountains for a turboprop like this unfeasible. Now, the possibility of this was likely discussed as part of the flight planning and briefing. The crew more than likely reviewed weather forecasts ahead of their departure. An alternate arrival was established in the Argentine city of Mendoza, which is only about 100 miles from their destination as the crow flies. So in the diversion, if weather conditions improve, it should then just be a matter of hopping over the mountains and landing straight into Santiago. And this is where a problem arises. The Fairchild had been loaded to high capacity, filling all of the seats in the cabin with cargo to boot. Under the performance constraints of the aircraft, it's not as simple to just fly over the mountains as one may assume. The Fairchild FH-227 had an operational service ceiling of 28,000 feet, but with a fully loaded plane, it won't reach that altitude, only cruising at around 18 to 20,000 feet. This is a problem because the mountains now between Mendoza and Santiago tower at around 23,000 feet, meaning navigating the direct route can be difficult, if not impossible. A jet plane of the era like a Boeing 727 or a Douglas DC-8 could easily do it, but propeller planes couldn't always make the direct route. Instead, props en route to Santiago from the east often flew over a lower elevation of the region known as Paso del Planchon, or the Planchon Pass. Conveniently, even in 1972, there was an official published airway that passed through here, defining a clear air corridor that any passenger plane, even propliners and turboprops, could use. At the time, it was called the G-17 Airway. Defining the sector that crossed the Planchon Pass were two VHF omnidirectional range beacons, VORs, positioned at two towns on either side of the mountains. There is Malagu on the east Argentine side of the Andes and Curacao on the west Chilean side. Drawing a line between the two on an outbound radial of 282 from Malagu gives you the airway. But for our plane, because Mendoza is about 160 miles north of here, this results in a kind of U-shaped flight route around the tallest of the mountains, transforming what would otherwise be a 30 to 40 minute direct route into a 90-minute flight plan. Once passing the Planchon Pass, the plane was expected to check in with Chilean air traffic control at Curacao, where they would then begin their descent, arriving into Santiago from the south. For Flight Commander Ferrades, he had crossed the Andes over 24 times in the past, and was likely more than familiar with this routing. However, as night fell on Thursday, October 12th, the weather situation had not really improved much. Many of the passengers took the opportunity to see a little of Mendoza that evening, lounging in cafes, catching movies, and some even went shopping. Of those who did, amongst the items that were purchased included chocolates and other snacks. These would later become amongst the survivors' food supply in the Andes. By sunrise on the Friday, October 13th, departure from Mendoza was still continually delayed into the afternoon due to adverse weather. The delays were frustrating news for the rugby team. They've already missed a night from their trip. However, the pilots have been attentive to weather forecasts, and conditions are marginal. They're expecting substantial turbulence en route. It's cloudy and visibility is poor. For pilots familiar with the route, it was often preferable to fly in the morning. Warm air flowing into the mountains throughout the day mixes with the cooler air in the Andes, creating powerful mountain waves that can be hazardous for aircraft. That said, there was an arrival from Santiago into Mendoza that day, a cargo plane that had successfully made the mountain crossing. Mr. Ferrades spoke to the pilot of this plane for a moment to gauge their thoughts, giving him the confidence to make the call. Weather was definitely not ideal, but it was good enough for the Fairchild. Ultimately, his hands were tied. Not only was there pressure to get going from the rugby team, but because the charter involved a Uruguayan military plane, Argentine law forbid any foreign military aircraft from staying on their soil for more than 24 hours. He has to get going, and eventually the plane got airborne again at 2:18 in the afternoon on the Friday. Leaving Mendoza, the flight heads south, climbing to an altitude of flight level 180, or 18,000 feet. From what we know, this first southerly sector of the flight was uneventful. Spirits were high in the cabin, as the 40 passengers expected to be on the ground in Chile in about 1 hour. Again today, co-pilot LaGuardia is flying the plane. Whereas Ferrades has previous experience flying over the Andes, he is supervising the co-pilot and would likely have been handling radio communications on this flight. As per the expected flight plan, they are on course and approaching the radio beacon at Malagu. The pilots are navigating the sky using radio navigation. The Malagu and Curacao VOR radio beacons transmit a signal that can be tuned into on the pilot's radio sets. The transmission from these stations can produce a response on the pilot's instruments, such as the radiomagnetic indicator, for example. With radios tuned into Malagu, the response from this instrument would have given a pointing needle in the direction of that station, giving clear indication to the pilots as to where their next waypoint is. Course selection can be used to intercept a precise radial going towards or out away from the VOR. That tracking could easily be followed on the horizontal situation indicator, with the course bar indicating deviation from the selected track. Distance measuring equipment is often used in combination with the VOR. With a separate radio receiver on the plane, this tells the pilots how far they are away from the selected beacon they are tuned into. This type of VOR to VOR radio navigation was commonplace for decades. These instruments were very much the standard at the time that all professional pilots would have been familiar with. At 3:08, Commander Ferrades reports position at Malagu. at which point the navigation status would have then changed over to Curacao, joining the G17 airway. To do that, from Molyneux they must fly an outbound radial with a selected course of 282 degrees. It's about 86 miles between the two radio beacons. Knowing their last position and using some information from the flight instruments, such as airspeed and heading, possibly factoring in the winds, they can calculate and time how long it should take them to make this crossing. From Molyneux, it should take roughly 23 minutes to reach Curacao, where they would then check in with Chilean air traffic control, reporting position there at around 3:31. It's very cloudy today over the Andes, though breakages in the cloud give intermittent glimpses of the mountains below. Snow-capped peaks blend in with the sky, sometimes making it difficult to distinguish between what is mountain and what is cloud. For the pilots, they can't see much visually and are only flying the needles for navigation. It's crucial they don't lose situational awareness. It requires their full attention at all times. Approaching the mountains, they begin to feel the onset of turbulence jostling the plane about. But as the clock hits 3:21, Commander Paredes makes another radio transmission. They have now reached the Planchon Pass, as expected, so he radios the flight's position here. So far, this appears to be normal. The plane was expected to be here at around this time, and for the next 3 minutes, our plane continues westward on course. Where all of this starts to get interesting is with another radio transmission at around 3:24, no more than 3 minutes later. By this point, our flight crew had switched over into Chilean airspace, so made contact with a controller in Chile. Now, sources unfortunately seem to be conflicting with what exactly the contents of this transmission were. I'm not sure if something got lost in translation over the years between writings. But what it seems is that at around 3:24, our flight reported either they were now at Curacao or they were still on track going towards Curacao, something along those lines. What is a bit more consistent is the pilots indicating a change of course towards their next waypoint at Maipú, which is in Santiago. Obviously, it's difficult to know exactly what happened here without so much as a cockpit voice recording transcript. But based on the rest of the flight, it looks like at 3:24, they mistakenly thought they were at or near Curacao, to the extent they changed course, turning to the right towards a northerly heading, as if they were proceeding with the rest of the flight as expected. From our perspective, mapping this out, we can see this is clearly incorrect based on a rough location of where the plane was when that transmission was made. They were still dozens of miles to the east, which still put them over the mountains. It should have taken roughly 12 minutes for them to fly from the Planchon Pass to Curacao. However, this change in navigation occurred no more than 3 minutes after the correct position report at the Planchon Pass, because the plane didn't actually crash in here, rather some 30 miles north. This was clearly a navigation mistake with catastrophic consequences. As to how this happened, we don't really know. Perhaps the crew were mistaken in their timing calculations. With limited or no visual references, it could be easy to wrongly interpret your position with a lack of situational awareness. Winds alone can have drastic effects on ETAs. If the pilots had failed to consider that, then that could explain a cause for them estimating a position way outside of their actual location. However, the primary form of navigation for this flight was radio nav. Weather was not ideal for visual navigation, and they were operating under an instrument flight plan. Using the VORs, the flight should have been able to stay on track all the way to Curacao. Now, it's possible that the needle for Curacao may not have been picked up straight away. The weather and the mountains between them and Chile could have made the signal a bit fuzzy, but even then, under radio navigation, a pilot can use an outbound track from their last waypoint, in this case Molyneux, and track that until a signal for Curacao could easily be received. Then, if DME, distance measuring equipment, was present and working, when tuned into the desired station, it displays distance that would then be shown in a small window like this. Tuning into Malagu, it would count up, showing their distance flying away, whereas tuned into Curacao, it would count down as they flew closer, cluing the pilots into their position along the airway. Assuming all of these navigation aids and instruments were present and working correctly, all it would have taken was a glance at their instruments to know they were not at Curacao when they made the turn. Unfortunately, we don't have a clear answer as to what happened here. What we do know is that from their perspective, their navigation status had changed. They turned north, proceeding with what appears to be the next leg of their journey, under the assumption they had navigated correctly, and for whatever reason, neither pilot on the flight deck noticed the mistake. I put it that way because there actually was a navigator on board. However, he wasn't in the cockpit. His body would later be found by the tail wreckage. It's probably worth noting that the original Fokker 27 and the Fairchild derivative only required 2 people to fly. There was an additional seat in the cockpit for a third crew member, but by the 1970s, navigator roles on passenger planes were on the way out, and there was often little for them to do. Some sources appear to suggest he had actually adopted a flight attendant's role, supporting the one official cabin crew member. This may make some sense for a packed, rowdy flight like this, but regardless, for whatever reason, he was in the cabin and wasn't present when navigation mistakes were being made. An extra pair of eyes may have gone a long way in preventing the outcome of the accident. Okay, let's take a step back here to look at this and ask ourselves, what does this say? Based on the map of the situation, the flight crew thought they were in a different geographical location compared to where they actually were. Where have I heard that one before? Then, our pilots appear to have progressed with their flight plan from the wrong position. In the radio communications between the flight and Chilean air traffic control, it must have been clear to them that they were now heading for the Maipú waypoint in Santiago. Now, ATC didn't have good radar coverage of that region and couldn't verify the location of the aircraft themselves. They relied on position reports from pilots, but because they had made a mistake, ATC were none the wiser. What happened then? 571 was given clearance to begin its descent from cruising altitude. However, still dozens of miles short of Curacao, this put them on a collision course with the Andes Mountains. For the next several minutes, deep in the cloud over the Andes, the Fairchild descends towards its fate. The pilots think they are now heading towards Santiago. Where they are actually going is straight into a very remote mountainous area that straddles the border between Argentina and Chile. Based on their new descent profile, they are on a collision course with a 14,800-foot mountain peak. It's hiding in the clouds. Passing through 17,000 and then 16,000 feet, turbulence continues to throw the plane about. Some of the passengers even commented that the reason the turbulence was so bad was because they were still flying over the mountains and were getting really close, not realizing just how true that was. Airflow around mountains can be very violent, with rushes of air going up and down and swirling around, and such severe mountain turbulence alone has been causal in air disasters before. But not this time. Instead, the Fairchild suffers a beating in the sky, but continues on. The plane is tossed up and down, sometimes hundreds of feet at a time, throwing passengers and luggage all over the cabin. Still, the plane descends, continuing through 15,000 feet, the pilots likely becoming ever increasingly uneased. The mountain turbulence is very strong, but they don't realize where they are. But then, at 3:34 in the afternoon, passengers look out of their windows and saw the edge of mountains just meters away. The Fairchild breaks out of the cloud, and in that moment the pilots would have probably hoped to see flat ground, towns and roads below with the Andes firmly off in the distance to their right. What they saw instead was the terrifying sight of a mountain that was coming straight towards them. More specifically, it's the edge of a massive valley. It's very high and very steep. Absolutely terrified by the sight, the pilots immediately apply maximum thrust to the plane's Rolls-Royce Dart engines and begin pulling back on the control wheel. The sudden change in pitch forces the passengers back into their seats. They can hear the struggle in the cockpit, their pilots desperately trying to pull their plane to safety. The ridge ahead of them stands at 14,800 feet. Having now descended considerably below that, the pilots must recover that height in a very short space of time. They pull the nose up and up, desperately trying to gain altitude to clear the ridge. Then the plane begins buffeting due to a massive loss of airspeed, but even risking a stall is not enough to save the plane, though it was a valiant effort in the time they had. The nose of the plane does clear the ridge, but the tail and wings suffer a catastrophic collision with the rocks. The tail cone immediately breaks away, the wings severed against the sloping terrain. The remnants of the right wing are thrown back over, destroying the tail separating from the fuselage, slicing the cabin open. 5 people were killed in the tail section at this time. The rest of the plane still carried some momentum. The wreckage then falls, flopping into the steep mountainside, sliding down the valley, where it eventually collided with a mound of snow, coming to a rest, scattered into pieces. The plane has crashed in the middle of absolute nowhere. Of the 45 people on board, 12 were killed in the plane crash itself. For the 33 initial survivors, some pulled themselves out of the wreckage with seemingly little to no injury, whilst others sustained unbelievable levels of trauma, which I will spare the details of here. They were conscious, in pain, in shock, tired, disoriented, and alone amongst themselves. Flight Commander Ferrades was killed instantly when his side of the cockpit was crushed in the crash. The crumpling had pressed him into the instrument panel, killing him. Lieutenant Colonel Lagrara, the pilot who was at the controls just moments ago, is still alive in the immediate aftermath, but is fatally wounded. He too had been crushed and was pinned inside of the cockpit, unable to move much. When other survivors found him, he repeatedly mentioned that he was sure they had passed Curacao. He then apparently tried to give coordinates to other survivors so they could radio a position for help. As the story goes, he then asked to be handed the firearm that was stored in the cockpit, a revolver. He was denied this, and as we understand things, no other information about what may have happened during the flight was exchanged before Dante passed away later that night. If you would like to hear more about what happened during the next 2 months, there is a plethora of content waiting for your viewing. Although I would say seek out some of the incredible writing about the Andes survival. But yes, for 2 months until late December 1972, these people had to survive up here. For a group of Uruguayans who lived in coastal lowlands, they weren't prepared for the mountains. They suffered altitude sickness, braced for cold temperatures and winds. They were malnourished, they rationed their meager food supply, and they even had to deal with an avalanche. Not all of them made it. 33 initial survivors turned into just 16 by the end of it, with a total of 29 fatalities. You would expect that a search and rescue mission would have located the crash site and the survivors pulled to safety. However, days passed and no one turned up. The plane itself wore a white livery and was nestled in the middle of a sea of white, snow-capped mountains. It would have been difficult to see at the best of times from the air. Additionally, the plane had flown outside of where it was supposed to be. Air traffic control didn't know where it was, and eventually the search was called off. The nightmare was over by December 23rd, 1972. Outside of South America, the disappearance of the plane only made footnotes in the news. In fact, it wasn't even the only plane crash to have occurred that day, and that turned out to be the deadliest air disaster to have ever occurred at the time. What happened there? Wikipedia says the cause was undetermined. We'll have to look at that one day. But by December, when the survivors were discovered in the Andes, the news stunned the world. especially after doctors looked at the survivors and, though they were malnourished, clearly they had, well, eaten something. Again, see the other works that detail the survival story. For however high profile of an air accident this is, there is still much that remains undetermined, which is par for the course when it comes to controlled flight into terrain events in the days before flight recorders and modern investigations. Argentine and Uruguayan authorities did conduct an investigation at the crash site. Photographs were taken and human remains taken care of. However, it was decided that the wreckage would be disposed of. It was buried and burned. Given what happened here, authorities couldn't just leave it there. A memorial now stands in the valley where the plane came to a rest. That said, in the days before the ground proximity warning system, an oral warning that alerts pilots when they are too close to ground or mountains, CFIT cases were a common type of plane crash. Well, to be honest, they continue to be even years after GPWS, just much less so. Accidents like these are littered throughout aviation history, especially in somewhere like South America, where mountains are plentiful. Take for example Seieta Flight 11. In 1976, a Vickers Viscount crashed into a glacier on Chimborazo in Ecuador, an absolutely gargantuan volcano that stands at over 20,000 feet. The pilots of that aircraft were navigating around stormy weather, but likely didn't realize that they had turned towards the volcano. In cloudy and poor visibility conditions, and again without GPWS, the Ecuadorian crew probably didn't realize what they were flying towards. In that regard, it makes it remarkably similar to the Uruguayan case. In fact, I very nearly made a video about the Seieta accident a few years ago. However, even less is known about it. Again, no flight recorder, no radar coverage, and no survivors. That's not even mentioning the fact that it took 26 years to find the wreckage of the plane, because when it did crash, it buried itself under deep snow and ice. Anyone that could possibly have initially survived were just left trapped under there. If you are wondering, in 2002, the Seieta wreckage was discovered when a group of climbers noticed the remains of the aircraft inside of a glacier which at that point had melted considerably. They didn't know exactly what it was at the time, and they could only confirm it was the missing plane following an expedition to examine the wreckage, where they found IDs of missing people from the flight and newspapers with the date of the disappearance, August 15th, 1976. Point is, accidents like these used to be quite common as far as plane crashes go, and in regions with little to no radar coverage, and in a time before the widespread adoption of flight recorders, it was difficult for investigators to arrive at definitive conclusions, with such limited information if the wreckage itself failed to yield answers. Of course, the aviation sphere has changed since the 1970s. Ground proximity warning systems are mandatory for all passenger planes and have only gotten better with time. So much of the planet is now covered in radar, with watchful eyes gazing upon a plane's every movement. Radio navigation is now long obsolete. Gone are the days where pilots had to rely on flying the needles. Now there is GPS, complex flight management systems, fly-by-wire, and so on. Nonetheless, the lesson here still feels relevant, doesn't it? Sometimes mountains do in fact hide in the clouds. So be careful. Hello everyone, thank you so much for making it to the end of another video. Wow, if you enjoyed it, be sure to drop a like and subscribe so you won't miss the next video. I am going to keep this outro short this time, but I will say that you should expect another video from me coming very soon. I promised I would make more videos this year, and I promised to deliver. We just have to cook. Anyway, it is that time. A massive thanks goes out to my Patreon supporters who have generously contributed to the channel. Their contributions go a long way in keeping my videos independent and also, at least right now, sponsor-free. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so be sure to say your thanks on the way out. As always, it's time to shout out some folks, beginning with the business class tier patrons. So in order of which they joined, let's say a big thanks to Dr. Andy Hill, Jamie Rose, Rob Henschel, and Movies Fua. I'm not so sure how you say that. And then we also have the legendary first class tier patrons. Special thanks goes out to Andrew Crawford, Adam Roth, Dawn Bailey, and Tendies4977. Absolute legends. Thank you all so very much. If you yourself would like to support the channel further, you can always join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons get early access to all new videos at least 2 days before they go out publicly on YouTube. That is where I'm going to leave you for now, but as I say, expect another video very soon. All I can say is, the less said about it, the better. Bye!